So zooming in on what happened way back when we set up, that's like hours and hours of content ago. But very important things happened back there. And the reason I want to zoom in on these necessarily is because when we look at something like database management, it's going to be very hard to make you seasoned database managers just based off of a couple of hours of content. It's something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of knowledge. And so we want to build that foundational knowledge for you. We want you to understand, hey, if I'm looking at Postgres and I'm looking at how it's set up, let me at least understand, what goes behind it. Like, where does it start and how did it start? Because, we're practically pros at querying. We know databases inside and out. And so with that, our query language is on point. But now we're looking at something else. Now we're looking at, hey, how is this thing set up? And, what's going on there, Mo? For that, those questions will be answered. When you set up Postgres, 3 databases were created. When we created the shape of the universe that is Postgres, we created 3 different databases during that setup, but you knew of none of them. You may have seen them here or there popping up around, depending on if you were playing around with the command line during your setup or using some other tool. You may have seen these, but those 3 databases were created. And those 3 databases, they reign supreme during our shape of the universe. I'm using this analogy to death, but, I'm butchering it slightly, but, what I'm trying to get at here is, when we set up Postgres, what we were trying to accomplish was setting up this shape of the universe that we could go ahead use to create more and more things. Because when we look at data is something that continues to expand. We get more and more and more data. And with that more and more and more data, you could theoretically look at it as kind of a universe, I guess. But analogy aside, like I've been using it a lot. What we created was a Postgres database, a template database, another template database. You're going to love this one. Why 2 template databases? Well, we'll get into that. But let's zoom in on this guy first, the Postgres database. Why was this created? And why these 3? Let's zoom in on that. Well, the Postgres database was the default database that is created when you set up Postgres. So when you do initialize DB, initdb, this is the command that, depending on how you set up Postgres, you may or may not have had to use. Now, we've automated the majority of the process for you during the setup to hide as much implementation from you as possible because we really, really wanted to focus on making you SQL masters, focusing on those SQL skills, those raw querying skills. All this management and this and that, we're getting to it now, but at the beginning, we really didn't want to overload you. When you set up your database infrastructure, you're setting up a Postgres database by default. And this is always going to happen by default because the default user you get with a Postgres installation is Postgres. So Postgres is the user and it creates a database called Postgres. Coincidence? I think not. Now, the first time you initialize Postgres, you can connect to the Postgres database that it's set up for you, the very first database. So here we see some command line. Again, something that we're going to be zooming in on during this portion of the course for a bit to get you some of those command line skills going. And we used some command line during setup to run some backups and restore some databases, but we really didn't focus on it throughout the course because, again, we chose a tool that was cross-platform, easy to use, easy for entry, that you could really go zone in, hone your skills on for select queries. And also, if you liked it, use with other database providers down the line. Now, with command line, the command line changes depending on which provider you use, PSQL or MySQL or Oracle. The command line interface will change heavily. So we wanted to give you that tool that is your bedrock. And you can change tools to change different bedrocks. And all these tools are basically doing the same thing for you. They're hiding the details so that you have an easy time managing different databases. The first time that you initialize, you can do the PSQL command. And the PSQL command is the main command that you use to log into a database and a host of other commands. And when we use it, we can give it a -u, which tells it, hey, I'm going to give you a user. So we give it the user Postgres, and then we can give it a database. And when we give it a database, that is the database it is going to connect to. Now, something interesting to note here. What if you don't give it a database? What would happen? Well, Postgres by default will assume a connection to a database with the same name as the user if no database is supplied. So if you did something like this, what it's going to do behind the scenes is it's going to assume that you're trying to connect to a database called Postgres. Now, why would it do that? Well, it's default behavior. What the architects were thinking, I can't necessarily tell you, but the default behavior is there. So it's by default always going to assume a connection to a database with the same name as the user. And this is true for any user. Who would ever do this? No one. You always give a database name when you are connecting. You always have to give a database name when you're connecting. There's no reason not to. If you do, well, now we know what the default behavior of Postgres is going to be. It's going to try to connect to a database with the same name as the user. And in the case of Postgres, if you're able to log in with that user, if you're not another user, well, yeah, it may work. But if you're a different user, you may not have a database with the same name as your user. So tough luck. Noting this default behavior, again, random, nitpicky knowledge, call it what you will, but it gives us an understanding of how this software actually is working a little bit. And with that, if we connected this way, and we went into the Postgres database and we connected, and we ran the command /coninfo, CONNINFO, it would tell us you are connected to the database Postgres. As the user, Postgres. Interesting. So it did exactly what we said. If we connected without giving it a database, it would do this. If you set up Postgres for the first time, you will not have any other database. So you have no choice but connecting to Postgres to create a different database. But what's most important here, and what I wanted to highlight, is this coninfo command. Because this command shows you your current connection. It's super useful. It's showing you where you are, what you're connected to. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing command. Remember it, cherish it, because it's just useful to know where you are. If you're switching around a lot, if you're switching between databases, sometimes you could forget where exactly you are and you just want to verify, hey, am I here? Am I in the right database? Am I with the right user? Do I have the right permissions? All good stuff. This won't check your permissions, of course, but based on which user you're logging in with, I assume that you would know whether or not you have access. So with that said, let's look at template databases and let's zoom in on those a bit.